Mr. Friedman, my question really goes to part one of your speech.
Sure.
It seems like you mentioned the word coercion, persuasion, and exchange about a half dozen times each.
Right.
And I think I understand the difference between exchange and coercion. But I'm confused about persuasion. And my question is, and perhaps you can answer it as quickly as I offer the question, but what is the difference between commanding somebody, A, commanding B to do something, i.e. coercion, and A, persuading B to do something?
The difference is that A commands B on the threat that if B doesn't do it, he goes to jail. Or if B doesn't do it, he gets hit over the head. In my opinion, I am going to distinguish between persuasion and coercion entirely on the basis of the actual use or threat of use of physical force. Not mental persuasion, not brainwashing. I find it impossible to accept brainwashing except under conditions of physical coercion as well. You may have a person held violently and brainwashed in that sense, but other than that, the fundamental distinction I would draw is the use of force.
Well, let me ask you this. You seem to say that coercion is bad, and I think persuasion is good because it helps us achieve the necessary cooperation and uniformity that makes the society hold together. But what are the implications of the freedom of the individual when individuals are barraged by all sorts of persuasive communications, by the media, by lawyers, by
I understand.
Business executives, by professors? We're constantly being persuaded. And what would John Stuart Mill say to my fear of being so persuaded that I really don't have free choice?
He would say to you, and I would say to you, as long as there are alternative channels of persuasion, as long as there's freedom of different views to be held, well then, I'm not worried. Maybe I should be, but I'm not. The real problem arises when you only have one thing you hear. Now, it is coercion. If you are prevented by force from expressing a view, if you're a citizen of the Soviet Union, you're dressed with a great deal of persuasion. But the sources are limited. And if somebody else wants to come in and try to persuade you differently, if a Solzhenitsyn or a Sakharov wants to persuade you differently, he's prevented how? By the threat of physical force. Or now, the fact that we have a great many different channels of persuasion is a very healthy thing, as long as there's no monopoly. And the real problem arises when we don't have a proper, well, let me give you I mentioned that one of the worst things we have is a control by FCC of radio and television. Why? Because it reduces the range and variety and alternatives of persuasive material. It gives a special advantage to the advertisers. You ought to have a system of radio or TV in which material can be disseminated the same way it is in print, in which you could do it through fee TV, paying for it, or other ways. But we use force, namely the denial of a license, the fact that a policeman will come and put you in jail if you operate in contravention to the FCC rules, to prevent alternative means of dissemination. In my opinion, that's why you have had a wasteland of television, in a phrase that Minnow used some years ago. So I think the fundamental answer to your question is that we must strive to keep all channels open. And if we do that, then it's very tempting for individuals to say, I want to be free of that. You know, freedom imposes costs as well as benefits. If you have to make up your own mind, that's a terrible thing. Most people would much prefer to have their mind made up for them. But if we're going to maintain a free society, each of us have to undertake the task of making up our own mind. Thank you.
In reference to talking about government's role in a free society, you mentioned some of the market failures, and I think that you may have just passed over one that is utmost importance, and that is of poverty. And in prefacing my question, I'd like to refer to what President Kennedy said, that if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. And to say that, well, we are a government of the people, and when there is a large sector of the people who are hurting, perhaps it is the responsibility of this government of the people to help out.
Well,
my question is regarding how free are the poor, how free are the unemployed, and how free are those people who are disadvantaged? Right. And so in reference to that, right, what is government's role?
Sure. First of all, I'm glad to see one vote for the poor. First of all, the government doesn't have any responsibility. People have responsibility. This building doesn't have responsibility. You and I have responsibility. People have responsibility. Second, the question is, how can we as people exercise our responsibility toward our fellow man most effectively? That's the problem. So far as poverty is concerned, there has never in history been a more effective machine for eliminating poverty than the free enterprise system and the free market. The period in which you had the greatest improvement in the lot of the ordinary man was the period of the 19th and early 20th century. Those of us in this room are the heirs of that. We benefited from the way in which our parents and our grandparents were able to come here. And by virtue of the freedom that was offered to them, were able to make a better life for themselves and them and us. But next, if you look at the real problems of poverty and denial of freedom to people in this country, almost every single one of them is a result of government action and would be eliminated if you eliminated the bad government failures. Let me be precise and specific. Why do we have so high an unemployment rate among black teenagers? It's a disgrace and a scandal. Why do we have so high an unemployment rate? First of all, because we give them lousy schooling through governmental schools, which make them unqualified to hold decent jobs. And second of all, we require employers to discriminate against them by not hiring them unless their productivity is enough to justify a minimum wage. The minimum wage rate is the most anti-Negro law on the books. And it's an anti-Negro law because it precisely, having first not enabled the young blacks to have a decent schooling so that they can have productivity, we next deny them the on-the-job training that they might get if you could induce employers by being able to hire them for relatively low wages to give them on-the-job training that would make them qualify for higher payment and higher productivity. In the third place, we have constructed a governmental welfare scheme which has been a machine for producing poor people. We have induced people to come under control of welfare. I'm not blaming the people, don't misunderstand me. It's our fault for constructing so perverse and so ill-shaped a monster as the whole set of welfare programs we have under which we encourage people, families to break up. We encourage people to move from one part of the country and come to another, under which we have, in effect, made many people poor. And yet, when all this is said and done, have I ever been where?
Welfare or poor.
I have, sir. Of course, more so than most of the people in this room. How many of you have worked a 12-hour day and gotten paid 78 cents? But let me go back to but you know that's all irrelevant. Is there one of you who is going to say that you don't want a doctor to treat you for cancer unless he himself has had cancer? I could go down the line. But when all is said and done, while there are people in this country who are worse off than other people, by and large, even the poorest people in this country are relatively well off compared to the conditions in many other countries in the world. What we take as our standard of poverty, is above the average income of all of the people in the Soviet Union, let alone of the people in India or China or in other countries. Now, that doesn't mean we should be satisfied with it. We are a wealthier country and we've been more productive, and we should set higher standards by ourselves. But by the same token, we ought to have a sense of proportion, and we ought to recognize both the source and the problem.
You say that you believe many people in America believe in your definition of freedom from coercion, and I might agree with you, but I also believe that many people in America believe in a different kind of freedom, and that is freedom to well-being, a certain level of standards, fair housing at a good price, education, etc. The other thing I want to say is that the system has built into it the poor remain poor and the rich remain rich, and that is an externality of the system.
It is not built into the system at all. It has never been true. It's simply a false. If you look at the evidence, there is an enormous amount of mobility from one class to the other. In fact, there used to be a saying, 3 generations from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, which reflected exactly the opposite effect. So it simply is not built into the system. On the contrary, there's a great deal of mobility within generations and between generations, and we shouldn't argue on the basis of false factual premises.
That mobility, well, let me continue because I'm not sure it really has an effect on the question. Because it is not immediately easy to become in the wealthy class. There are certain parts of the system which make that virtually impossible for the real person. Now, I believe that this freedom too represents the belief in equality as opposed to liberty. And I wonder, is it possible to build a system based on this equality, which I believe that many people agree in, and would not be willing to sacrifice to the liberty of freedom from?
Well, I'm not going to be able to give a full answer to your question because you've asked a very, very complex question, and so you're going to have to pardon me if I am a little dogmatic. But I only want to suggest that the statements I'm making are not without some thought and reason behind them. In my opinion, a society that aims for equality before liberty will end up with neither equality nor liberty. And a society that aims first for liberty will not end up with equality, but it will end up with a closer approach to equality than any other kind of system that has ever been developed. Now, that conclusion is based both on evidence from history, across history, and also, I believe, on reasoning which, if you try to follow through the implications of aiming first at equality, will become clear to you. You can only aim at equality by giving some people the right to take things from others. And what ultimately happens when you aim at equality is that A and B decide what C shall do for D. Except that they take a little bit of a commission off on the way.
I'd like to ask a question on behalf of the lawyers in the audience. You talked tonight a lot about freedom, and it seemed to me that one of the types of freedom that was implicit in your talk was the freedom for an individual not to act, as well as the freedom for an individual to act. And this, in light of your discussion of externalities and market failure, reminded me of a problem in law that's called the non-feasance-misfeasance distinction. And the typical example is the Good Samaritan paradox. And that simply is, if I'm walking alone on a beach, and I look out in the water and there's somebody drowning, does society have the right to impose upon me the duty to rescue that person in the water? In other words, am I no longer free not to act? And so the question I'd like to ask you, Professor Friedman, is under what circumstances may government in a free society impose upon an individual a duty to act?
Note the shift you've made. You started with society and ended up with government. Are those synonymous?
That's a rhetorical question that has an implied answer.
It sure does. Let's go back. Let's go back, because what you're really asking is a very fundamental question, and we can leave aside the legal aspects of it. The real question is, what's the case for believing in freedom? In particular, is a man free to sin? Because this is what you're really saying. If I see you about to sin, am I free to let you sin? If I know that you're sinning, the answer is no. The justification for freedom is that we don't know. That who are we to judge for our fellow man? Humility, the belief that after all I can try to persuade you but I can't force you, must ultimately rest on a recognition of the limitations of our knowledge. We don't say that there isn't such a thing as sin. All we say is we can't be sure we're right when we think it. Now you see this man walking on the beach. How can anybody force him to go out and rescue that fellow? And is it right to force him? You know, that's a problem that it's not easy to face. What we want to do, we want freedom, in my opinion. First, because we cannot know. We can never be sure we're right. And therefore, we have no right to force our views on other people. And second, because the thing that's really important is the individual's own values and his own beliefs. If you're not free to sin, then neither are you free to be virtuous. Virtue is a meaningless concept unless an individual has a free will to choose between one act and another. You and I might think very, very well of that individual if he jumped in and tried to rescue the man sinking. And we will impose that value on him through the social process whereby we construct values and transmit them to one another. A good society will certainly be one in which people in that position will be strongly inclined to move out and try to rescue the man there. But that's a very different question from saying that if the society is bad, we can make it good by using force to drive him out there to bring the other man in. I'm not sure that's an answer to your legal question, but it's an answer, I think, to the moral question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to the next one.
Okay. In your book, Capitalism and Freedom, which I've read cover to cover,
Gee, thank you.
you presented the thesis that capitalist society was a prerequisite for a free and democratic society. But how does this fit with the example of South Africa, a nation which fits your criteria for a capitalist society? It has relatively unregulated free enterprise, market diversification, and multinational participation, but in no way could be considered free with apartheid discrimination and forced labor by the passbook law.
I'm afraid you read the book from cover to cover, but not line by line. Because you will find that the statement in question is that a free market economy is a necessary, but not a sufficient condition for a free society. I have never argued that it's a sufficient condition, only that it's a necessary condition. So I said in there, I gave examples of societies which predominantly relied on market economies, on market mechanisms for their economy, but yet were not by any stretch of the imagination free societies. So I don't believe that's a contradiction. I think free societies are very rare things. And most societies at most time in human history have not been free. So I don't know any simple formula to produce a free society. I only know that if you don't have a market economy, you won't have a free society.
I'd like to follow up. How do you see the role of the multinational in a system like South Africa?
Well, I believe we have to separate issues. I believe that on the whole, the blacks in South Africa have benefited greatly from the multinationals in South Africa so far as their economic condition is concerned. You know, I want to say something to you people. This is Stanford, and I want to tell you something that it seems to me about the multinationals in South Africa. I think you missed a great opportunity here in this university. A while ago, as I understand it, there was a commission here that was investigating the question of the cost to Stanford in endowment income if it were required to restrict its investment to enterprises that had no connection with South Africa. Is that right? Wasn't there such a group that investigated it? And as I understand it, they came out with a conclusion that it would cost something like, I think it was $300 or $400 per student per year. And then they made the wrong choice. What they should have done is they should have said to the students, any students who want to pay $300 or $400 more a year, we will segregate that part of the portfolio and invest it in this way, not going into South Africa. And of course, they should have offered the same opportunity to the faculty. Because the problem is it's too cheap to get your gratifications at somebody else's expense. You pay for them. See, the real, if I may again digress, I think one of the real objections people have to the market system, the real reason why the market has a bad press and there's an anti-market mentality, is because a market makes people pay for what they get. It makes people responsible. And of course, everybody would rather have somebody else pay for them. So if you go to this case, I remember when I was in South Africa, I've been there, I'm surprised I haven't been picketed on that account. I spent a day with the leader of the Zulu tribe, a very intelligent, thoughtful, far-sighted black man who was there, Gacha Buthelezi. An extraordinarily impressive person, and I have seldom spent a day that I learned more from. If you asked him that question, there's no doubt what he would say. And what he did say, what he has said in public speeches, that the way to help South Africa is not to cut off the capital, which provides the opportunity for expansion and for employment for the blacks, but that's not the way to help South Africa. That's not the way to help the blacks.
Changed his mind a month ago.
No, he didn't.
Yes, he did.
He made a speech of a different kind a month ago. He said he had lost a great deal of hope in the possibility of having the kind of multinational, multiracial society that he had been expecting to have.
That's because it's a capital crime to say explicitly that you supported international.
Well, I don't believe, as I say, the speeches that he gave some earlier time are available on the record for you to read and to look at. It's, in any event, as I say, I do not believe it is an issue. I think it's an issue that each one of us must face separately. I think each of us should be willing to put his own money where his mouth is.
Can and does the marketplace deal effectively with irreversible externalities? I'm not sure you've touched
For
upon it
example?
completely. And this is a hypothetical, but may be true, air pollution, assuming that the world can only handle so much pollution, can we really leave it up to the marketplace to deal with that sort of an irreversible or potentially irreversible externality?
Well, insofar, there's no difference between irreversible and non-irreversible ones. If it's, if the benefits can be identified, if you can make it subject to the market, if you can make the costs be borne by those people who are involved and responsible for it, well then, they will have every incentive to take account of the future effects. It's the argument of whether the fact that you have, let's say, finite resources somehow or other prevents the market from providing for the future. So that the situation for what you're calling irreversible is, I think, no different for the non-irreversible. In the case where you have strong externalities, the fundamental answer to you is that there is no good solution. You see, we must not let the best be the enemy of the good. Utopianism is a great disease. The idea that there's something wrong doesn't mean that there's something better. So that in many of these cases, there may be no good solution. That's why I stressed that I do not think you can make a hard and fast list of what things government can do. You have to look at each case and look at its pros and cons. But you have to be even-handed, and in that evaluation include government failure as a likelihood as well as private failure. On the whole, my impression is that governments have been far less farsighted than private individuals have been. That they have been far more willing to play fast and loose with the distant future than have private individuals and private groups.